The gunshot that killed Marshal Otis Redding echoed off the sandstone walls of Cimarron Gulch just as Charlotte Graves stepped out onto the boardwalk with a basket of mending, and the sound of it would haunt her dreams long after the blood had been washed from the dust of Main Street. It was the autumn of 1881, in the high plains country of the New Mexico Territory, where the town of Cimarron Gulch sat like a stubborn weed between the Cimarron River and the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo foothills. Charlotte was 22 years old, the only daughter of Sheriff Amos Graves, a man whose reputation for fairness had kept the peace in that rough country for the better part of a decade. She had grown up watching her father pin on his star each morning with the same solemn care a preacher might give to opening his Bible, and she had learned early that justice, in a place like Cimarron Gulch, was a fragile thing that had to be tended like a fire in a windstorm. She did not see the shooting itself. She heard the crack of the pistol, then the second crack, and then the shouting that followed like thunder chasing lightning across the flat land. By the time she had gathered her skirts and run the length of the boardwalk, Marshal Redding lay sprawled in the street with his hat knocked into the horse trough and a dark stain spreading across his vest, and 3 men on horseback were already wheeling their mounts toward the edge of town, dust boiling up behind them like smoke from a grass fire. Her father arrived moments later, his boots pounding the planks, his own revolver drawn but too late to do any good. Amos Graves knelt beside the dying marshal and held his hand until the light went out of the older man's eyes, and Charlotte stood frozen at the edge of the crowd that had gathered, her basket forgotten in the dirt, her heart hammering so hard she thought the whole street must hear it. She had seen the shooter's face. Not for long, not more than the space of a breath, but she had seen it clear as day when the man turned his horse and looked back once at the fallen marshal, a look of cold satisfaction crossing his features before he spurred away. She knew that face. Everyone in Cimarron Gulch knew that face, because it belonged to Wade Kessler, foreman of the Bar K Spread and right-hand man to Old Man Silas Bracken, the wealthiest and most feared rancher in 3 counties. That night, after the undertaker had come and gone, and the town had settled into the uneasy quiet that follows violence, Charlotte sat across the kitchen table from her father in the small house behind the jail, watching him turn his coffee cup around and around without drinking from it. "You saw him," Amos said. "It was not a question." "I saw him," Charlotte answered. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Wade Kessler, clear as I see you now, Papa." He turned back and looked, like he wanted to make certain the marshal was dead before he rode off. Amos rubbed a hand across his weathered face. He was 50 years old that autumn, with more gray in his beard than brown, and the events of the day seemed to have added another decade to the lines around his eyes. "Bracken will have every lawyer between here and Santa Fe defending Kessler if it comes to trial, and Bracken has friends on the territorial bench. Without a witness who will stand up in that courtroom and say what she saw, there is no case at all. Kessler walks free, and Otis Redding's murder goes into the ground with him." "Then I will testify," Charlotte said. Her father's eyes lifted to hers, and something in them was not relief but fear. "Charlotte, you understand what that means. Bracken is not a man who takes kindly to being crossed. If you stand in that courtroom and point your finger at Kessler, you will be painting a target on your own back and mine besides. I have seen what happens to witnesses in this territory. I buried 2 of them myself, out past the county line, in unmarked graves because their families were too frightened to claim them." Charlotte reached across the table and took her father's hand, the same hand that had taught her to ride and to shoot, and to read the sky for coming storms. "Marshal Redding was a good man. He was your friend. If nobody stands up and says the truth, then what was the point of any of it, Papa? What was the point of the badge you wear, if the law bends whenever a rich man's money is set against it?" Amos said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the smell of dust and distant rain that would not fall for weeks yet in that dry country. "I will need you to think on it overnight," he said finally. Sleep on it, and if you still feel the same in the morning, then we will send word to Judge Harmon in Santa Fe and set the wheels turning. But Charlotte, once those wheels start, there is no stopping them. You understand that?" "I understand," she said, though in truth she did not yet understand the half of what was coming, the weight of fear that would settle over her in the days ahead, or the man who would ride into her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. Theodore Vaughn had been in Cimarron Gulch only 8 months when the shooting happened, having come west from Missouri after the death of his father left him a modest inheritance and a restless heart that could not settle into the quiet farming life his family had always known. He was 26 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders from years of honest labor, with dark hair that curled at his collar when he forgot to have it cut, and eyes the color of good whiskey held up to lamplight. He had bought a modest spread of land some 6 miles north of town, calling it the Rocking V, and had spent the better part of a year building a herd of cattle from nothing but sweat and stubbornness, and the sort of patient hope that men who work the land learn to carry with them like a second skin. He was not a rich man, not by the standards of Silas Bracken and his sprawling Bar K empire, but he was an honest one, and in that country honesty was worth more than most men gave it credit for. He had met Charlotte Graves only twice before the shooting, once at a church social where he had been too tongue-tied to say more than a few words to her, and once when her father had ridden out to his spread to ask after a stray steer that had wandered onto Rocking V land. Both times he had come away thinking of her more than a man ought to think of a woman he barely knew, the way her laughter carried across a room like music, the steadiness in her gray eyes when she spoke, as though she had already decided the world was worth facing head-on rather than flinching from. He heard about the shooting from a drover who rode out to the Rocking V 2 days after it happened, bringing news the way news always traveled in that country, faster than any telegraph wire could carry it. Marshall Redding dead, Wade Kessler suspected. The sheriff's daughter the only witness, and Bracken's men already making quiet threats around town, the kind of threats that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Theodore saddled his horse that same afternoon and rode into Cimarron Gulch, though he could not have said exactly why, except that something in him would not rest easy knowing that a young woman he had thought of more than once in quiet moments was standing alone against the full weight of Silas Bracken's money and menace. He found Sheriff Graves in the jailhouse office, sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers he did not seem to be reading, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window that looked out over the dusty street. "Sheriff," Theodore said, removing his hat as he stepped through the door, "I heard about Marshall Redding. I am sorry for it. He was a fair man." Amos looked up and something like recognition crossed his face. "Vaughn, the Rocking V, is that right? What brings you into town?" "I heard your daughter saw the shooting," Theodore said. "I heard there is talk of trouble for her on account of it." Amos's jaw tightened. "There is more than talk. Bracken sent a man to the house last night, polite as you please, saying it would be a shame if something happened to a fine young lady before she had the chance to marry and raise a family. My daughter has not slept easy since." "That is a coward's threat," Theodore said, feeling heat rise in his chest. "It is Bracken's way," Amos said wearily. "He never dirties his own hands. He lets fear do his work for him, and fear is a patient tool. It does not need to strike quickly to be effective." Theodore stood there a moment, turning his hat in his hands, and then he said the thing that would change the course of all their lives, though he did not know it yet as more than an offer of simple decency. "I would like to speak with her, Sheriff, if she would permit it, not to press her one way or another about testifying, only to see that she has friends in this town who mean to stand by her, whatever she decides." Amos studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies a horse he is thinking of buying, weighing the lines of him, the steadiness of his gaze. "She is out back, hanging wash. You may go around if you like." Charlotte was indeed hanging wash when Theodore came around the side of the jailhouse, her arms raised to pin a sheet to the line, Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a few strands of dark hair escaped from her braid to curl against her neck in the afternoon heat. She startled slightly when she heard his boots in the dirt, then relaxed when she saw who it was. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, "I did not expect to see you in town." "I heard what happened," he said. "I am sorry for the marshal, and I am sorry for the trouble that has come to your door because of what you saw." She turned back to her wash, though her hands were not quite steady on the pins. "Everyone in Cimarron Gulch has an opinion on what I ought to do, Mr. Vaughn. My father wants me safe, though he is too proud to simply forbid me from testifying. The preacher tells me it is my Christian duty to see justice done, and Bracken's men have made it clear what will happen if I do." "What do you want to do?" Theodore asked. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it, without any weight of expectation behind it, seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him then, really looked, as though seeing him for the first time. "Nobody has asked me that yet, not truly. I am asking now." Charlotte set down the basket of wash and wrapped her arms around herself, though the day was warm. "I want Marshal Redding's killer to hang for what he did. I want to look Wade Kessler in the eye in that courtroom and watch him understand that money cannot buy him out of everything. But I am afraid, Mr. Vaughn, I will not pretend otherwise. I am afraid that if I speak the truth, I will not live long enough to see it matter." "Then you should not speak it alone," Theodore said. "Whatever you decide, you should not have to stand against Bracken and his men with nothing behind you but your own courage, however considerable that courage might be. And what would you propose instead? You are not the law, Mr. Vaughn. You are a rancher with a small herd and a mortgage if the talk in town is accurate." He almost smiled at the bluntness of it, though the moment was far too grave for smiling. "That is true. I cannot offer you the protection of a badge or the weight of a fortune, but I can offer you this. If you testify, I will stand beside you through every part of it, from now until the trial is finished and beyond. I will not let you face Bracken's men alone, not for a single hour of a single day. That is not justice, Miss Graves, I know that. But it is something, and I mean to give it to you if you will let me." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as though trying to read the truth of him in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know a woman who saw a man murdered and did not look away. I know a woman willing to risk everything for the sake of the truth, in a country where truth is too often the first casualty of greed. That is enough for me to want to stand beside her." It was not a declaration of love. Not yet. Not in the way such things are spoken in more settled places, where courtship follows careful and predictable steps. But something passed between them in that moment. Standing in the dusty yard behind the jailhouse with the wash flapping on the line like pale flags of surrender. Something that neither of them could yet name, but that both of them felt settle into their chests like the first ember of a fire that would, in time, grow to warm them both for the rest of their lives. "I will think on your offer," Charlotte said. "And I will think on my father's plea for me to stay silent, and the preacher's plea for me to speak, and my own heart's plea for justice. Give me until tomorrow, Mr. Vaughn. Take whatever time you need," he said. "I am not going anywhere, Miss Graves. Not while there is trouble at your door." That night, Charlotte lay awake in her narrow bed listening to the wind and thinking of Theodore Vaughn's words, and of her father's tired eyes, and of Marshal Redding's face gone pale in death, and of the terrible weight of the choice before her. She thought, too, though she scolded herself for it, of the way Theodore's eyes had held hers, steady and unafraid, as though he had already decided that whatever came, he would not flinch from standing beside her. By morning, she had made her decision, though it was not so simple as saying yes or no to testifying. She rose before dawn and walked to the jailhouse office where her father sat already awake, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. "Papa," she said, "I have decided." He looked up, bracing himself for whichever answer she gave. "Tell me." "I will testify," she said, "but not for nothing, not simply because it is right, though I believe it is. I have thought all night on what justice means in this territory, and I have come to understand that justice alone will not keep me safe, nor will it mend whatever is broken in a town that lets a man like Bracken run roughshod over the law because he has money enough to buy silence. I want more than a conviction, Papa. I want a promise that whatever happens in that courtroom, I will not simply go back to living in fear afterward, waiting for Bracken's revenge to find me on some lonely road. What is it you are asking for, Charlotte? I do not yet know entirely, she admitted. But I know I will not stand up and speak the truth until someone gives me something better than the empty comfort of having done my duty. I want a future, Papa. I want to know that speaking the truth will not simply be the end of my safety, but the beginning of something worth having. Amos studied his daughter for a long moment, and something like understanding, and perhaps a touch of sorrow, crossed his weathered face. You have been talking to young Vaughn. I have, she admitted, feeling color rise in her cheeks. He offered to stand beside me, whatever I decided. It was the first such offer anyone has made that did not come wrapped in either fear or duty. Then perhaps, her father said slowly, you had best go speak with him again and see what more he is willing to promise before you decide what it is you are asking the town of Cimarron Gulch to give you in exchange for your testimony. Charlotte found Theodore that same morning, having ridden into town early to check on a load of feed he had ordered from the mercantile. She caught him outside the store, his arms full of grain sacks, and the sight of her hurrying toward him with such purpose in her stride made him set the sacks down at once. Miss Graves, he said, you look as though you have made a decision. I have, she said, but it comes with conditions, Mr. Vaughn, and I mean to lay them before you plainly, because I think you are a man who values plain speaking above flattery. I am listening. I will not testify simply for the empty satisfaction of seeing justice done, not when justice in this territory has a way of costing witnesses their lives before the ink is even dry on the verdict. If I stand up in that courtroom, I want to know that I am not merely trading my safety for the comfort of having done right. I want something more than justice waiting for me on the other side of it. I do not yet know how to ask for such a thing, Mr. Vaughn, because I am not entirely certain what it looks like. But I know I felt something yesterday, standing in that yard, that I have not felt with any other man in this town, and I think perhaps you felt it too. Theodore's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he could not find words, though his heart was pounding as though he had run the full 6 miles from the rocking V rather than ridden it easy on horseback. I felt it, he said finally. I have thought of little else since yesterday afternoon. Then here is what I am asking of you, Theodore Vaughn, Charlotte said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her mouth seemed to settle something between them, some understanding too large for the small, dusty street to contain. If I testify against Wade Kessler, and if Bracken's men come for me afterward as everyone fears they might, I want to know that I am not facing that danger only to return to an empty house and a lonely life, waiting for the next threat to arrive. I want to know that there is something on the other side of all this fear worth having. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, for that would be foolish and hasty and beneath us both. But I am asking you to promise me that you mean to court me properly, to stand beside me not only through the trial but through whatever comes after, and to build something with me that is better than mere justice. Justice only looks backward, Theodore. It only settles old wrongs. I want something that looks forward. Theodore set down the last of his grain sacks entirely and took her hands in his, right there on the street where anyone might see them, though at that hour the town was quiet and few were about to witness it. Charlotte Graves, he said, and her name felt like a vow in his mouth, I promise you this. If you testify, I will stand beside you through the trial and beyond it. I will court you as properly as any man in this territory has ever courted a woman, and I will build with you whatever future you are willing to build with me, be it a house, a family, a life on the rocking V, or wherever else you choose to make your home. I cannot promise you safety, for no man can promise such a thing in this country. but I can promise you that you will never face whatever comes alone, not for one single day, not for the rest of my life." Charlotte felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to appear weak at the very moment she needed her strength most. "Then I will testify," she said, "and I will hold you to every word of that promise, Theodore Vaughn." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and for a moment, standing there in the dusty street with the morning sun climbing over the eastern hills, the danger and the fear seemed to recede just slightly, pushed back by something warmer and stronger, something that felt very much like the beginning of love. Word of Charlotte's decision to testify spread through Cimarron Gulch faster than fire through dry grass, and it was not long before Silas Bracken himself learned of it, sitting in the parlor of his sprawling ranch house some 10 miles east of town, a glass of good whiskey in his hand, and a scowl darkening his heavy features. "The girl means to testify," he said to Wade Kessler, who stood near the window with his hat still on his head, a habit that would have earned a sharp word from Bracken on any other day, but today seemed a minor thing beside the larger trouble at hand. "She is a fool, then," Kessler said, "or her father is a fool for letting her." "Fools or not, they mean to see you hang," Bracken said, draining his whiskey and setting the glass down with a hard click against the polished table. "I did not build this ranch from nothing to watch my foreman swing from a rope because a sheriff's daughter has more courage than sense. You will need to see to it, Wade, that she changes her mind, or that her testimony never reaches that courtroom at all. And how do you propose I manage that? Half the town watches her comings and goings now on account of the sheriff's fretting." "There are more ways to silence a witness than violence," Bracken said, "though violence remains available to us should gentler methods fail. Find out what she wants, what she fears, what she loves. Every person has a weakness, Wade. It is only a matter of finding it and pressing upon it with sufficient patience." What Bracken did not yet know, and what would prove his gravest miscalculation, was that Charlotte's weakness, if it could be called that, was not fear for her own safety but love for a man who had promised to stand beside her, and that love, once properly kindled, was not so easily extinguished by threats or by money, however considerable either might be. The weeks leading up to the trial passed in a strange blend of danger and tenderness that neither Charlotte nor Theodore could have anticipated. True to his word, Theodore rode into Cimarron Gulch nearly every day, sometimes on the pretext of business at the mercantile or the feed store, other times with no pretense at all, simply to sit on the porch of the sheriff's house and talk with Charlotte while her father kept a watchful eye from inside, his shotgun never far from reach. They spoke of many things in those weeks, not only of the trial and the danger that hung over them like a storm cloud that had not yet broken, but of smaller things too, the things that build the foundation of a life shared between two people. Theodore told her of his childhood in Missouri, of his father's small farm and the long winters that had taught him patience, of his mother's death when he was but 14 and the grief that had followed him west like a shadow he had never quite managed to outrun. Charlotte told him of her own mother, who had died of a fever when Charlotte was 7, leaving her to be raised by her father amid the rough company of deputies and drifters, and the occasional outlaw brought in for a night in the jail before being sent on to the territorial court in Santa Fe. "I suppose that is why I am not so frightened of danger as some women might be," she told him one evening, sitting on the porch steps with the sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and violet behind the western hills. "I grew up watching my father face danger every day of his life, and I never once saw him flinch from it, not truly, not even when his hands trembled afterward in the privacy of our kitchen. I suppose I learned that fear and courage are not opposites, Theodore. They live side by side in the same heart, and a person simply has to choose each day which one to let lead." "That is a wise way of looking at it," Theodore said. "Wiser than I managed at your age, certainly." I spent a good deal of my younger years simply running from things I did not wish to face, my father's death chief among them. It was only when I came west and had nothing left to run from but myself that I began to learn what you seem to have known all along. And what is it you have learned? She asked. That a man is only as good as the promises he keeps, Theodore said, and that some things are worth more than safety, worth more than comfort, worth more even than one's own life. I did not fully understand that until I met you, Charlotte. I think perhaps I am only beginning to understand it now. She looked at him then in the fading light, and something passed between them that neither needed to name aloud, though both felt its weight settle into their chests like a promise sealed without words. It was in such quiet moments, more than in any grand declaration, that their love took root, growing steady and sure amid the uncertainty that surrounded them, like a hardy desert flower that finds a way to bloom even in the harshest and most unforgiving ground. But the danger was never far from the surface of those weeks, and it announced itself again on a night in late October, some 10 days before the trial was set to begin. Charlotte had gone to bed early, exhausted from the strain of preparing her testimony with the territorial prosecutor who had come up from Santa Fe, a careful, precise man named Mr. Aldous Finch, who had warned her repeatedly of the difficulty of the case, and the skill of the lawyers Bracken's money would surely provide for Kessler's defense. She woke near midnight to the sound of breaking glass, and her heart leapt into her throat even before she was fully awake, some animal instinct recognizing danger before her waking mind could name it. She heard her father's voice, sharp and commanding, and then the crack of a gunshot, and she was out of bed and reaching for the small pistol he had given her only weeks before, the one she had practiced with in the yard behind the jailhouse until her aim was steady enough to satisfy him. By the time she reached the front room, the danger had already passed, though the evidence of it remained plain enough. A rock had been thrown through the front window, wrapped in a scrap of paper that her father now held in trembling hands, his own revolver still smoking from the shot he had fired into the darkness after the fleeing rider who had thrown it. "What does it say?" Charlotte asked, though some part of her already knew. Amos read the note aloud, his voice tight with fury. "Tell the girl silence is cheaper than a coffin. Bracken's patience runs thin." Charlotte's hands were shaking, though she willed them still with an effort of will that left her breathless. "They mean to frighten me into silence." "They mean more than that," her father said grimly. "This is Bracken testing how far he can push before he must resort to something worse. We will need to send for extra protection before the trial, Charlotte. I cannot watch this house alone every hour of every day, and Finch will need you alive and unharmed to testify, whatever else happens." Word of the attack reached Theodore before dawn, carried by a boy sent running from town who had heard the commotion, and recognized the urgency of getting word to the rocking V. Theodore was in the saddle within minutes, riding hard through the darkness with his heart pounding harder than his horse's hooves against the packed earth of the road. He found Charlotte sitting at the kitchen table when he arrived, pale but composed, her father pacing the small room like a caged animal, unable to settle after the night's fright. "Charlotte," Theodore said, crossing the room in 3 long strides and kneeling before her chair, taking her hands in his own. "Are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am not hurt," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Only frightened, Theodore, more frightened than I have been since this whole business began. They threw a rock through the window with a note attached, threatening my life if I do not stay silent." Theodore's jaw tightened, and something hard and protective settled into his eyes. "Then I will not leave this house again until the trial is finished, Sheriff, if you will permit me to stay. I will sleep in the barn if I must, or on this very floor, but I will not have Charlotte facing another night of such danger without someone standing watch who cares for her safety as much as I do." Amos studied the young rancher for a long moment, weighing the offer, and something in his weathered face softened slightly. "I would be grateful for the extra pair of eyes, Vaughn, and I think perhaps my daughter would sleep easier knowing you were near." And so it was arranged that Theodore would stay at the sheriff's house in the days leading up to the trial, sleeping on a cot set up in the front room, close enough to hear any disturbance in the night, while Amos took what rest he could between long hours of patrolling the town and coordinating with the few deputies he trusted to help guard against further attacks. It was an unconventional arrangement, one that would have raised eyebrows in more settled society, but Cimarron Gulch in that season of danger had little patience for propriety when lives hung in the balance, and Charlotte found in Theodore's presence not the awkwardness she might have expected but a deep and abiding comfort, the sort that comes from knowing one is not alone in facing the dark. They spent the evenings of that strange, tense fortnight talking quietly by lamplight after Amos had gone to make his rounds, Charlotte mending shirts or reading aloud from the few novels the town's small library could offer, Theodore whittling small figures from scraps of wood, a habit his father had taught him as a boy, patient work for patient hands during long winter evenings on the Missouri farm. "What will you do?" Charlotte asked him one evening, "after the trial is finished, whatever the outcome? Will you return to the rocking V and forget all this business, or has it changed something in you, the way it has changed something in me?" Theodore set down the small carved horse he had been working on, a delicate thing with a flowing mane that he had shaped with careful, patient strokes of his knife. "I do not think I could forget it if I tried, Charlotte. Not the danger and certainly not you. I made you a promise, and I mean to keep it, whatever the verdict. I mean to court you properly, as I said I would, and I mean to build something with you that is worth more than the fear we have faced these past weeks. That has not changed, and I do not believe it ever will, even if Kessler is acquitted. Even if Bracken's money buys the outcome he wants, and we are left with nothing but the danger and none of the justice we hoped for. Even then," Theodore said firmly, "justice is not the only thing worth fighting for, Charlotte. I told you once that I could not promise you safety, but I can promise you love and loyalty, and a life built on something sturdier than the whims of a courtroom. Whatever happens when the judge reads the verdict, I will still be standing beside you, and I will still mean every word I have promised." Charlotte felt her heart swell with something that had grown steadily over the past weeks from tender affection into something far deeper, something she was no longer afraid to name, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. She loved this man, this quiet, steady rancher who had ridden into her life at its most dangerous hour and refused to leave, whatever the cost to himself. "I love you, Theodore Vaughn," she said, the words coming out simply without preamble, because she had grown tired of dancing around a truth that had settled so firmly into her heart. Theodore's hand stilled on the wooden horse, and he looked up at her with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Charlotte felt her breath catch in her throat. "I love you too, Charlotte Graves," he said. "I believe I have loved you since that first afternoon in your father's yard, watching you hang wash on the line as though the whole world had not just tilted on its axis around you. I have simply been waiting for the right moment to say so, though I suppose there may never be a truly right moment in times such as these. So I will say it now, plainly, and trust that plain speaking suits us both. I love you and I mean to marry you, Charlotte, when this trial is finished and you are safe if you will have me." "I will have you," Charlotte said, and the tears she had held back for so many weeks finally spilled over, though they were tears of joy now rather than fear. "I will have you, Theodore, whatever the verdict, whatever comes after. You have already given me something better than justice, exactly as I asked. You have given me a love worth building a life around, and that is worth more to me than any verdict a courtroom could deliver." They did not kiss that evening, for propriety still held some sway even amid the danger that surrounded them, and Theodore was too much a gentleman to press for more than the words already spoken. But he took her hand and held it gently in both of his own, and they sat together in the lamplight until the hour grew late, speaking softly of the future they meant to build, the house they might raise on the rocking V, the children they might one day have, the quiet, ordinary happiness that seemed, in that dangerous season, more precious than any treasure Bracken's fortune could buy. The trial began on the 3rd of November, in the small courthouse that served as the seat of territorial justice for that stretch of New Mexico, a plain adobe building with a shingled roof and windows that let in more dust than light. Judge Harmon presided, a thin, severe man with a reputation for fairness that had survived, thus far, the temptations of Bracken's wealth, though many in town whispered that his fairness had never before been tested against stakes so high. The courtroom was packed on the morning Charlotte was called to testify, every bench filled with townsfolk eager to witness the proceedings, and a heavy contingent of Bracken's men standing at the back of the room, with expressions that made no secret of their hostility. Theodore sat in the front row, directly behind the small table where Mr. Finch prepared his notes, his eyes fixed on Charlotte as she walked to the witness stand with her chin held high in her hands, though trembling slightly, folded calmly before her. Wade Kessler sat at the defense table beside a sharp-featured lawyer from Santa Fe who had clearly been well paid for his services, and his eyes followed Charlotte's every movement with an expression that made Theodore's blood run cold, though he forced himself to remain still, trusting that any outburst on his part would only harm Charlotte's cause. "Miss Graves," Mr. Finch began, once the preliminary questions of identity and oath had been completed, "will you tell the court, in your own words, what you witnessed on the afternoon of the 14th of October, in the year of our Lord 1881? Charlotte's voice was steady when she spoke, steadier than she had feared it might be, and she found, as she began to recount the events of that terrible afternoon, that the fear which had haunted her for weeks seemed to recede in the face of the simple necessity of telling the truth. "I was standing on the boardwalk outside my father's office," she said, "when I heard 2 gunshots. I looked toward the sound and saw Marshal Redding fall to the ground, and I saw 3 men on horseback wheeling to ride away from the scene. One of those men turned back to look at the marshal before he rode off, and I saw his face clearly. It was the face of the man sitting at that table beside his lawyer. It was Wade Kessler." A murmur ran through the courtroom, quickly silenced by a sharp rap of Judge Harmon's gavel. Kessler's face had gone pale, though his lawyer rose at once to begin his cross-examination, seeking to cast doubt on the reliability of Charlotte's identification, the distance from which she claimed to have seen the shooter's face, the brevity of the glance she described. "Miss Graves," the lawyer said, his tone dripping with practiced condescension, "is it not true that the distance from the boardwalk to the location of the shooting was some 40 yards or more? Is it not possible, in the chaos and fear of the moment, that you were simply mistaken about the identity of the man you saw?" "It is not possible," Charlotte said firmly. "I have known Wade Kessler by sight for 3 years, since he first came to work for Mr. Bracken. I would know his face anywhere, at any distance, in any light. There is no mistake in what I saw." The lawyer pressed further, attempting various angles of attack, suggesting that Charlotte's testimony had been coerced by her father's ambition to see the Barquet Ranch brought low, or that her account had changed in the retelling over the intervening weeks. But Charlotte held firm against every challenge, her voice never wavering, her account never shifting from the simple, terrible truth of what she had witnessed. It was during a recess in the proceedings, as the court broke for the midday meal, that the true danger of the trial made itself known in a manner that would test not only Charlotte's courage, but Theodore's promise to stand beside her through whatever came. Theodore had stepped outside the courthouse to fetch water for Charlotte, whose throat had grown dry from the long hours of testimony, when he found himself confronted in the alley beside the building by 2 of Bracken's men, their hands resting meaningfully on the grips of their pistols. "Vaughn," one of them said, a broad-shouldered man named Curly Dunn who worked as one of Bracken's chief enforcers. "Mr. Bracken thought you might want to reconsider your involvement in this business. It would be a shame if something happened to that fine spread of yours while you are spending all your time playing bodyguard to the sheriff's girl. "Are you threatening my property, Dunn?" Theodore asked, keeping his voice level though his heart had begun to pound with fury rather than fear. "I am simply passing along a friendly word of advice," Dunn said, his smile showing no friendliness at all. "Mr. Bracken is a patient man, but his patience has limits. If the girl's testimony continues to go poorly for Mr. Kessler, there may come a reckoning that touches more than just her." Theodore stepped closer, close enough that Dunn's smile faltered slightly at the intensity in his eyes. "You may tell Mr. Bracken that I do not frighten easily, and neither does Charlotte Graves. Whatever threats he means to make against my property or my person, they will not change the truth of what she witnessed, nor will they change my intention to stand beside her through this trial and every day that follows it. If Bracken wishes to test that resolve, he is welcome to try, but he should know that I will meet any threat against her with the full measure of whatever I have to give, including my life if it comes to that." Something in Theodore's steady, unyielding tone seemed to give Dunn pause, and after a long moment of tense silence, the other man stepped back, muttering something about simply passing along a message before he and his companion retreated back toward the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. Theodore stood alone in the alley for a moment, breathing hard, before he collected himself and returned to fetch the water he had originally set out for, determined not to let Charlotte see the fear that still trembled in his hands. He told her of the encounter that evening, once the day's proceedings had concluded and they had returned to the relative safety of the sheriff's house, unwilling to keep such a threat secret from her when secrets in this dangerous business had already proven costly enough. "They threatened your ranch," Charlotte said, her face going pale with worry. "Theodore, you must protect the rocking V. You have worked too hard to build it to lose everything on my account." "I will not abandon you to protect a herd of cattle," Theodore said firmly. "The rocking V can be rebuilt if it comes to that, Charlotte. You cannot. I made you a promise, and threats against my property will not shake my resolve to keep it. But what if they burn it? What if they kill your herd or worse? Then we will rebuild together, once this trial is finished and Kessler faces whatever justice the court decides," Theodore said, taking her hands in his. "I did not offer you my protection with conditions attached, Charlotte. I offered it freely, and I mean to see it through, whatever the cost." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the day's testimony. "You are a better man than I deserve, Theodore Vaughn. You deserve every good thing this world has to offer," he said, "and I mean to spend the rest of my life making certain you receive it, insofar as it lies within my power to provide." The trial continued for 3 more days, with additional testimony from Sheriff Graves regarding the physical evidence found at the scene, and from a doctor who had examined Marshall Redding's body and confirmed the trajectory of the fatal shots matched the position from which Charlotte claimed to have seen Kessler firing. Kessler's lawyer mounted a vigorous defense, calling several witnesses who claimed Kessler had been elsewhere at the time of the shooting, though under Mr. Finch's careful cross-examination, their stories proved inconsistent and poorly rehearsed, clearly the product of hasty coaching rather than genuine recollection. On the 4th day, as the jury retired to deliberate, tension in the town of Cimarron Gulch reached a fever pitch, with Bracken's men gathering in larger numbers than ever near the courthouse, their presence a silent but unmistakable threat should the verdict not go their way. Theodore stayed close to Charlotte's side throughout the long hours of waiting, and Amos kept his deputies posted at every entrance to the building, determined that no violence would erupt within the sanctity of the court itself, whatever might happen once the crowds dispersed. The jury returned after 6 hours of deliberation, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that Charlotte could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. "We find the defendant, Wade Kessler, guilty of the murder of Marshall Otis Redding." The courtroom erupted into a chaos of sound, some cheering, some shouting protests, Bracken's men near the back muttering curses and moving as though they might rush forward before the sharp crack of Judge Harmon's gavel, and the leveled shotguns of Amos's deputies convinced them to think better of it. Kessler's face had gone the color of ash, and he was led away in irons, his lawyer already muttering about appeals that would, in the end, come to nothing, for the evidence had been too clear and the jury too convinced by Charlotte's steady, unwavering testimony. Charlotte felt the weight of weeks of fear lift from her shoulders all at once, though it was quickly replaced by a new and different sort of tension, the awareness that Bracken himself, sitting near the front of the courtroom with a face like a thundercloud, had not yet accepted defeat and might well seek some manner of revenge for the loss of his foreman and the public humiliation of the trial's outcome. That fear proved well-founded, though not in the manner anyone might have expected. As the courtroom began to empty, Bracken rose from his seat and made his way directly toward Charlotte and Theodore, his heavy face flushed with barely controlled fury, and for a moment Theodore's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his hip, though he forced himself to keep it holstered, aware that violence within the courthouse itself would only make matters worse. "Miss Graves," Bracken said, his voice low and dangerous despite the crowd still milling about them. "You have cost me a valuable man today and made a fool of me before this entire territory. I do not forget such debts easily. Marshal Redding's blood is on your foreman's hands, Mr. Bracken," Charlotte said, refusing to let fear creep into her voice despite the danger radiating from the older man's furious expression. "If you feel humiliated by today's verdict, perhaps you ought to consider more carefully the character of the men you choose to employ." Bracken's face darkened further, and he seemed about to speak again, some threat rising to his lips, when Theodore stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Charlotte and the enraged rancher. "Mr. Bracken," Theodore said, his voice carrying a warning that had not been present in his tone before that moment, "the trial is concluded, the verdict rendered by a jury of your own territory's citizens. If you have any further business to conduct regarding this matter, you would do well to conduct it through legal channels, for I promise you that any attempt to harm Miss Graves, now or in the future, will be met with the full force of whatever resistance I am capable of offering, and I do not offer that resistance lightly." For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other, the young rancher and the powerful cattle baron, and something in Theodore's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to give Bracken pause. The way a man might hesitate before stepping on a rattlesnake he had mistaken for harmless until it raised its head and showed its fangs. "You have made a dangerous enemy today, Vaughn," Bracken said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier fury, replaced by something more calculating. "I do not forget insults, and I do not forgive them easily." "Then we understand each other," Theodore said, "for I do not forget threats against the woman I love, and I do not forgive them at all." Bracken's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise at the boldness of the declaration, and after a moment more of tense silence, he turned and strode from the courtroom without another word, his men falling into step behind him like a pack of wolves whose alpha had, for the moment, decided against the hunt. The weeks following the trial brought a strange, watchful peace to Cimarron Gulch, as the town waited to see whether Bracken would seek revenge for his humiliation, or whether the public nature of his defeat, combined with Theodore's clear warning, would convince him to let the matter rest. For a time, it seemed the danger might indeed have passed, and Charlotte allowed herself, cautiously, to begin dreaming of the future Theodore had promised her, a future built not on fear but on love and steady, patient hope. Theodore courted her properly in those weeks, exactly as he had promised, riding into town several times each week to sit with her on the porch of the sheriff's house, bringing small gifts, a length of blue ribbon that matched her eyes, a book of poetry he had ordered specially from Santa Fe, a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself along the road from the Rocking V. They attended the Sunday services together, drawing knowing glances and whispered speculation from the townsfolk, and they walked together along the banks of the Cimarron River on the rare evenings when the autumn weather permitted such leisure, speaking of the life they meant to build together once he had properly asked her father for her hand. That moment came on a crisp evening in late November, when Theodore rode into town with a small velvet box tucked carefully into his saddlebag, containing a modest ring he had purchased from the jeweler in Santa Fe, with money he had been saving since the day of Charlotte's first testimony, unwilling to wait a single day longer than necessary to make his intentions formal and binding. He found Amos in the jailhouse office, as had become his habit, and the older man looked up from his paperwork with an expression that suggested he had already guessed the purpose of the visit. "Sheriff Graves," Theodore began, "I have come to ask your permission to marry your daughter." Amos set down his pen and studied the young rancher for a long moment, though there was no real surprise in his weathered face, only a sort of quiet satisfaction that had been building for weeks as he watched the courtship unfold. "You have already proven yourself worthy of her, Vaughn, more than I could have hoped for when this whole dangerous business began. You stood beside her when it would have been easier and safer to stay away. You kept every promise you made, and you did not flinch even when Bracken himself threatened you directly. I could not ask for a better man to entrust with my daughter's happiness. Then I have your blessing." "You have my blessing, and my gratitude besides," Amos said, extending his hand, which Theodore shook firmly. "Though I suspect the more important permission you will need to seek is my daughter's own, and I do not believe that will prove difficult to obtain." Theodore found Charlotte in the kitchen, preparing supper, and he did not wait for any elaborate speech or careful preparation, for their courtship had never been built on formality but on honesty, and he saw no reason to abandon that habit now. "Charlotte," he said, and something in his voice made her turn from the stove immediately, her hands still dusted with flour, her eyes finding his with an expectation that suggested she already knew what was coming. He knelt then, right there in the small kitchen with the smell of baking bread filling the air around them, and opened the small velvet box to reveal the ring inside, a simple band of gold with a small sapphire set into it, chosen because its color reminded him of her eyes in the fading evening light. "Charlotte Graves," he said, "I promised you once that if you testified, I would court you properly and build with you a future better than mere justice. I have tried to keep that promise these past weeks, and I mean to keep it for the rest of my life if you will allow me. Will you marry me?" Charlotte's hands flew to her mouth, flour and all, and tears sprang immediately to her eyes, though these were tears of pure joy, unmarred by any of the fear that had shadowed so much of their courtship. "Yes," she said, the word coming out almost before he had finished speaking, as though she could not bear to wait even the small additional moment it would have taken to answer properly. "Yes, Theodore, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at composure, and then he rose and took her into his arms, and their first kiss, so long delayed by propriety and danger both, was everything that weeks of careful courtship had promised, gentle and warm and full of the quiet certainty that they had found in each other something rare and precious. A love built not on the fleeting excitement of danger, but on the sturdy foundation of shared courage and mutual respect. Their wedding was set for the second week of December, a modest affair to be held in the small church that served Cimarron Gulch, with Reverend Prout presiding, and the whole town invited to celebrate what had, by then, become something of a local legend, the story of the sheriff's brave daughter and the rancher who had stood beside her through danger and testimony both. But Silas Bracken had not forgotten his humiliation, and though he had kept his distance in the weeks following the trial, his patience, as he had warned, was not infinite. He had spent those weeks not in idle brooding, but in careful planning, consulting with lawyers about the possibility of an appeal that even his considerable fortune could not ultimately deliver, and turning increasingly toward darker thoughts of more direct revenge. It was 5 days before the wedding, on a cold evening with the first snow of the season beginning to fall over the high plains, that Bracken made his final move. He sent 4 of his men, led by Curly Dunn, to the rocking V under cover of darkness, with instructions to burn the barn and drive off the herd Theodore had spent nearly a year building, a punishment meant to strike at the young rancher's livelihood even if his person and his bride-to-be remained, for the moment, beyond Bracken's willingness to directly harm. Theodore had been staying at the rocking V that week, tending to preparations for the wedding and the small house he had been expanding to accommodate his future wife, and he woke near midnight to the smell of smoke and the panicked bawling of cattle being driven from their pens. He was out of bed and dressed within moments, his rifle in hand, running toward the barn where flames were already licking up the old dry timber, casting an orange glow against the falling snow that made the whole scene look like something from a fevered dream. He found Dunn and 2 other riders driving cattle out through a broken section of fence, and without thinking of the danger, he raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air, shouting for them to stop. "Vaughn." Dunn called back, wheeling his horse to face him, a pistol already drawn. "Mr. Bracken sends his regards, and a reminder that debts unpaid come due eventually." "You will pay for this, Dunn," Theodore shouted back, moving to protect what remained of his herd even as the barn continued to burn behind him. What followed was a brief, chaotic exchange of gunfire in the darkness and falling snow, more frightening for its confusion than for any real danger, since neither side seemed inclined toward outright murder, Bracken having apparently instructed his men to focus on destruction of property, rather than bloodshed, mindful perhaps of how badly a second killing might play before a territory already inflamed by the outcome of Kessler's trial. Theodore took a graze along his upper arm from a stray shot, painful but not serious, and managed to drive off the raiders before they could complete the destruction of his herd, though the barn was lost entirely, along with a good portion of his winter feed stores. Word reached Charlotte the following morning, and she arrived at the rocking V within the hour, her heart in her throat with fear that had nothing to do with her own safety and everything to do with the man she loved, finding Theodore in the yard directing efforts to salvage what could be saved from the smoking ruins of the barn, his arm bandaged but his spirits, despite the setback, remarkably unbroken. "You are hurt," she said, rushing to him, her hands going immediately to check the bandage on his arm. "Only a scratch," he assured her, though he allowed her fussing over the wound with the patient tolerance of a man who understood that her worry was its own form of love, not to be dismissed lightly. "The barn is lost, and I have lost perhaps a dozen head of cattle to the raid, but it could have been far worse, Charlotte. I am alive, and so are you, and that is what matters most." "Bracken did this," Charlotte said, fury rising in her voice even as relief at finding Theodore alive continued to wash over her in waves. "He could not have his revenge through the courts, so he sought it through violence instead. He has shown his hand now," Theodore said grimly, "and in doing so he has given your father grounds to act against him directly, rather than simply against Kessler. Arson and cattle rustling are crimes enough to bring federal marshals into this territory if local authority proves insufficient, and Bracken's fortune will not protect him forever against charges so clearly connected to a documented pattern of witness intimidation." Indeed, when Amos Graves learned of the attack, his fury was matched only by his determination to see Bracken finally brought to account for the pattern of threats and violence that had shadowed the entire affair from its beginning. He rode to the territorial capital himself, presenting evidence of the threatening notes, the attack on his own house, and now the burning of the rocking V barn to Judge Harmon and to the federal marshal's office, building a case that even Bracken's considerable influence could not entirely deflect. It took the better part of 2 months, well past the date originally set for Charlotte and Theodore's wedding, but eventually Silas Bracken found himself facing charges of his own before Judge Harmon's court, charges of arson, cattle theft, and conspiracy to intimidate a witness in a capital murder trial. Faced with evidence that included sworn testimony from several of his own men, who had grown weary of serving a master whose recklessness now threatened to bring federal scrutiny down upon the entire Bar K operation, Bracken ultimately accepted a plea that stripped him of a substantial portion of his fortune in restitution and fines, and exiled him from the New Mexico territory entirely, forbidden from ever again setting foot within its borders under threat of immediate arrest. It was not the hanging that some in Cimarron Gulch had hoped for, but it was justice of a sort, sufficient to end the reign of fear that Bracken's wealth and ruthlessness had cast over the town for so many years, and sufficient, too, to allow Charlotte and Theodore to finally proceed with their long-delayed wedding, without the shadow of further violence hanging over their heads. The wedding, when it finally took place on a bright, cold morning in early February of 1882, was a joyous affair that seemed to draw the entire town of Cimarron Gulch together in celebration, as though the whole community understood that this marriage represented something larger than the simple union of two people, a symbol of hope triumphing over fear, of love proving stronger than the intimidation that had so nearly poisoned the town's spirit. Charlotte wore a simple dress of white cotton, sewn by her own hands with careful attention to every seam, her dark hair swept up beneath a small veil that had belonged to her mother, the only physical inheritance she possessed from a woman she barely remembered but whose memory she carried always in her heart. Theodore stood at the front of the small church in his best suit, his arm fully healed from the wound sustained in defending his ranch, his eyes bright with a happiness that seemed to fill the whole building with warmth, despite the cold February air outside. Amos Graves walked his daughter down the short aisle himself, his face a study in mixed emotion, pride and joy tangled together with the bittersweet awareness that he was giving away the daughter who had been his whole world since her mother's death so many years before. When he placed her hand in Theodore's before the altar, he leaned close and whispered words that only the two of them could hear. "Take good care of her, Vaughn. She is the finest thing I have ever helped bring into this world, braver than any man I have known, myself included. I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of that trust, Sheriff," Theodore whispered back. And then the ceremony began in earnest, Reverend Prout speaking the familiar words that had bound couples together since time immemorial, and Charlotte and Theodore exchanging vows that felt, to both of them, less like the beginning of something new than the natural culmination of a love that had already been tested by fire and violence and the full weight of a powerful man's fury, and had proven, through it all, unshakable. "I, Theodore Vaughn, take you, Charlotte Graves, to be my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm it, "to love and to cherish, in danger and in peace, in poverty and in plenty, for as long as we both shall live. I promised you once that I would give you something better than justice, and I mean to spend every day of our life together making certain that promise is fulfilled anew. I, Charlotte Graves, take you, Theodore Vaughn, to be my husband," Charlotte replied, her own voice thick with joyful tears, "to love and to cherish, in danger and in peace, in poverty and in plenty, for as long as we both shall live. You have already given me more than I dared to hope for, Theodore, and I mean to spend every day of our life together giving that same gift back to you, 1,000-fold." When Reverend Prout finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very rafters, and as Theodore leaned down to kiss his new bride, Charlotte felt certain that whatever hardships the future might hold, she would face them now with a partner beside her, whose love had already been proven in the fires of the most dangerous trial of her young life. They spent their wedding night at the Rocking V, in the small but sturdy house Theodore had built with his own hands, expanded now with an additional bedroom, and a proper kitchen in anticipation of the family they hoped, in time, to raise there. The new barn, rebuilt with the help of neighbors who had rallied around the young couple in the aftermath of Bracken's arson, stood solid and strong against the winter wind, housing a herd that had recovered from the raid and grown steadily through careful husbandry, and the sort of patient, honest labor that had always been Theodore's particular gift. Charlotte took to ranch life with the same steady courage she had shown throughout the trial and its dangerous aftermath, learning to ride the range alongside her husband, to help with branding and calving when the season called for it, to manage the household accounts with the same careful precision her father had brought to his duties as sheriff. She missed, at times, the bustle of town life she had known growing up, but she found in the quiet rhythms of the Rocking V a different sort of richness, the deep satisfaction of building something lasting with the man she loved, watching their small herd grow year by year, watching the modest house expand as their family in time began to grow as well. Their first child, a son they named Otis after the marshal whose death had brought them together, was born in the autumn of 1882, nearly exactly a year after the shooting that had set their story in motion. Amos Graves, who had by then retired from his position as sheriff, having grown weary of the dangers that came with wearing a badge in that rough country, took to grandfatherhood with a joy that seemed to erase years from his weathered face, spending long hours at the Rocking V teaching young Otis the same skills he had once taught Charlotte: how to ride, how to read the sky for coming weather, how to face the world with courage rather than fear. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Eleanor after Theodore's mother, a bright, curious child who grew up chasing chickens across the yard and riding perched in front of her father on his horse almost before she could properly walk. And 2 years after that came another son, Amos, named for the grandfather who doted on him shamelessly, spoiling him with small gifts and stories of the old days whenever he visited, which by then had become a regular and cherished part of the family's life, Amos having taken up residence in a small house he built on the edge of the Rocking V property, close enough to see his grandchildren grow, but far enough to give the young family their proper privacy. Wade Kessler, meanwhile, served his sentence in the territorial prison, his appeals exhausted, his fortune's protection stripped away entirely once Bracken's own downfall left him without resources to continue funding legal challenges. He would spend the better part of 15 years behind bars before his eventual release, by which time the world of Cimarron Gulch had changed so thoroughly around him that he chose to leave the territory entirely rather than face the ghosts of his old life, a quiet and fitting end to the violence that had once seemed poised to destroy so much. Silas Bracken, exiled from the territory and stripped of much of his fortune through the fines and restitution ordered by Judge Harmon's court, retreated to relative obscurity in California, where he lived out his remaining years, a diminished and largely forgotten man, his once mighty Bar K empire broken up and sold off in parcels to smaller ranchers, several of whom, in a turn of fate that seemed almost poetic in its justice, had once worked as his own hired hands before growing disillusioned with his cruelty and abandoning his service. As for Charlotte and Theodore, their love, forged in the fires of danger and tested by threats that might have broken a lesser bond, only grew stronger with each passing year. Theodore built the Rocking V into one of the most respected ranches in the county, known not for the size of its herd, which remained modest by the standards of the great cattle barons, but for the fairness and honesty with which it was run, principles that Theodore had carried with him from his father's small Missouri farm, and that Charlotte had absorbed from watching her own father wear the sheriff's star with unwavering integrity for so many years. They told their children, when they were old enough to understand, the story of how their parents had met, of the terrible shooting that had brought them together, of Charlotte's brave decision to testify despite the danger, and of Theodore's promise to give her something better than justice, a promise he had spent every day since proving true through the steady, patient love he offered her without fail. Justice matters, Charlotte would tell young Otis and Eleanor and Amos as they grew, gathered around the kitchen table on winter evenings while the wind howled outside and the fire crackled warm in the hearth. And your grandfather taught me that a person must never be afraid to speak the truth, whatever the cost of speaking it. But justice alone is not enough to build a life upon. It only settles the wrongs of the past. What your father taught me, what he gave me when I needed it most, was something more, a promise of a future worth having, a love strong enough to stand against fear itself. That is the greater gift, children, and I hope you will each find such a gift for yourselves one day, whatever trials you might face along the way. Theodore, listening from his chair by the fire, would catch Charlotte's eye across the room, and something would pass between them even after all those years of marriage. The same spark that had first kindled in a dusty yard behind the jailhouse so long ago. The same steady certainty that had carried them through danger and testimony and violence and loss, all the way to this warm, safe, joyful life they had built together against every threat that had once seemed poised to prevent it. They grew old together on the rocking V, watching their children marry and raise families of their own, watching the town of Cimarron Gulch grow from a rough frontier settlement into a proper town with a schoolhouse and a proper church, and eventually even a small hospital. The wild dangers of those early years gradually giving way to the settled peace of a territory, finally finding its footing. Amos Graves lived to see his grandchildren grow into adulthood, passing away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the family he had helped bring together through his own steady commitment to justice, and mourned by a town that remembered him as the finest sheriff Cimarron Gulch had ever known. Charlotte and Theodore themselves lived long, full lives, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The Rocking V having grown by then into a thriving operation, passed down through the careful stewardship of their eldest son Otis, who had inherited his father's steady hand with cattle, and his mother's unwavering commitment to fairness in all his dealings. On that anniversary evening, sitting together on the porch of the house Theodore had built with his own hands so many decades before, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same brilliant oranges and violets that had colored their earliest conversations, Charlotte reached over and took her husband's weathered hand in her own. "Do you remember," she asked, "what you promised me, that first day in my father's yard, when everything seemed so uncertain and dangerous?" "I remember every word of it," Theodore said, his voice softened by age but still carrying the same steady warmth it had held on that long-ago afternoon. "I promised to stand beside you, whatever you decided, and to give you something better than mere justice if you chose to testify." "You gave me exactly that," Charlotte said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky. "You gave me a whole life, Theodore, a life I never dared to hope for in those frightening days. You gave me love strong enough to outlast every threat, every danger, every fear that once seemed poised to consume us both." "And you gave me the same," Theodore said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her silver-streaked hair. "You gave me courage, Charlotte, the kind of courage I did not know I possessed until I stood beside you through that trial and everything that followed it. We built something together, you and I, something far better than justice alone could ever have provided. We built a life." They sat together in the gathering dusk, two people who had faced danger and fear and violence in their youth, and had emerged from it not broken but strengthened, their love having proven, through every test that fate and Silas Bracken's cruelty could devise, to be exactly what Charlotte had asked for on that first frightening day so many years before, something better than justice, something that had grown, over 5 decades of shared life and shared love, into the finest and most lasting treasure either of them had ever known. And as the stars began to emerge over the high plains of New Mexico, scattered like diamonds across the vast dark canvas of the sky, Charlotte Vaughn, once Charlotte Graves, the sheriff's brave daughter who had refused to testify until promised something better than justice, closed her eyes against her husband's shoulder and felt, as she had felt every single day since that dangerous autumn of 1881, profoundly and completely at peace, safe in the knowledge that whatever the years still had in store for them, she would face it exactly as she had faced everything else in her remarkable life, with courage in her heart and Theodore's steady hand in hers, together until the very end.